Good afternoon, everybody. This is the Pass Ball Show, brought to you by JohnPielli.com, as well as St. Aloysius Church over in Jackson, New Jersey. A lot of stuff we're going to get into today, and appreciate everybody that's taking the time to tune in. I'm going to ask a couple questions to start off, but we are going to get into our normal stuff: baseball, sports, and unifying America, as we always do. And as we get towards the middle of the week, we could hit a bunch of contentious sports topics, and then at a certain point, you get to where, all right, how many times are you going to rant about the same thing? And this is usually a good time of the week where we talk about some of the issues that we have going on in this country and what is legitimately the most important thing for us. And it is the safety. And obviously, every time that there is another shooting that we see out there, this time in Florida, the natural reaction is to, grieve for the families of the victims and, feel terrible for anything that could possibly, we envision this, and we always look at it from an outside perspective as if, this could never happen to us. And on January 1st, when I decided to do a show, I was going to take New Year's Day off, and then there was that shooting in Long Branch. And the reaction that I had to it was pretty much the reaction that we need to all have to every single one of these shootings that end up impacting us. And, unfortunately, we're lucky and fortunate enough to, in most of our cases, now obviously there's exceptions to the rules, right? There are people that have been involved in it. They have family members and loved ones that end up, losing their lives or, get seriously hurt in these type of shootings. But for the majority of us, we're kind of looking at it as an outsider. We're looking at it from a perspective of being, somebody that's not 100% in tune. It's not impacting our lives. It's not changing our lives, which, by the way, I do want to say, thankfully, that I think we finally got a good camera angle here on Facebook Live. For the exception of my ugly mug, I'm pretty happy with the view that I got. It gets the majority of the studio. It doesn't have my head missing or isn't in a weird area or a weird spot. So I feel comfortable with the way the camera is set up right now. But go back to what I'm saying. Every time there's a shooting, we tend to look at it in a way where we are assuming that it will never happen to us. And we are free from the possibility that, a shooting could impact us at close range. And every time this happens, and I'm going to continue to say the same thing, and if you get tired of my rant and my discussion when it comes to this, just turn the program off. Because I seriously believe that we all individually have the ability to stop that next shooting. And it's all about being close enough to the people that we know, but also to keep an ear out for people that can use a little bit of advice, can use a little bit of positivity. We see so much of the doom and gloom crowd, whether it's at our day jobs or out in public or even amongst our family and our friends. And the unfortunate thing about it is we just tend to judge afterwards. We wait for that person to leave. And then we say, you know what? He's not wound too tight, or, he's having a bad day, or he's too depressed, or, she seems like there's something wrong with her. We tend to have that conversation after the people leave. And in some cases, what we really need is for that person to discuss with us what's going on, why they feel a little down, why they're a little out of it, why they are maybe a little more doom and gloomy than we normally expect. And until we start doing that, we are leaving ourselves open that any one of us could pop out of the woodwork and let things get to them to a point where they want to commit an act of violence. And they may not even be rational. They may not even be the kind of people that would ever think about wanting to hurt anybody. But when they allow these negative feelings and these thoughts that are going on in their head, because nobody wants to console, nobody wants to give them the time to speak or spend a moment with them and care a little bit about the fact that they may be a little out of it or a little unhappy. Everybody is leaving the possibility that somebody around them can go out there and be the next person that's shooting. And once again, like I said, when it happened in Long Branch, which was close enough to the place of the, a place that was close enough, the fact is that it could happen to you. It could happen to you wherever you are. And I do thank, and I'm going to continue to comment on the feeds, whether it's through Periscope and Facebook Live. Why do I have sheets on the wall? It's, just maybe a uniqueness. Now, clan robes get stained. I think that's awesome that you would suggest that. Unfortunately, it doesn't play to anything that is going on here. But I think that's awesome that you would decide to do that. But anyway, we'll continue to go on here. When it comes down to people that are getting, down on themselves, and the fact that people are just not caring enough in regards to what anybody else is doing or wanting to even be in a position where they could help. And they are just as responsible as the person around them that decides to go get the gun and start shooting people. And it's unfortunate. But what continues to happen is we continue to be ignorant, and we continue to look at these same situations in the same way. When we say, oh, woe is me. It's so sad. I feel for the victims, as if it can't happen to me. And, the unfortunate thing is we don't seem to care. But we make like we care in a just an unfair, in a way that is not constructive enough to the problem that is going on. And as long as we continue to do this, we are going to continue to have these shootings. And we're going to continue to have the million Facebook posts about so many people that are scared and sad. And, it's unfortunate that we go in a way where we just don't seem to care about what ends up happening until it happens. We don't want to take any preventive measures. And at some point we will. And, until that happens, we're not going to get anywhere. But I do want to throw the phone number out there. If you want to be involved, call into the show. 732-364-3598. That's 732-364-3598. Anything that's on your mind in the world of baseball, sports, and unifying America. I was listening to something today that I thought was pretty interesting. The media, the way it's set up, and the way to go out there, just about anybody can do a show, myself included. And, you put yourself out there, and anybody that pretty much wants to can start and do their own show. So what I'm doing is not different than what you, the person that's listening right now, you, the guy that's on Periscope railing on me right now, can go out there and go do your own show. The branding is very difficult to do because there's so many different types of shows that are out there. And for the listener can pretty much listen to any type of thing that they want. And you can listen to a regular show that's on a major station or on simulcast on TV, or somebody doing a podcast, whether it's on iTunes or syndicated, or it could be just some guy out on the street that just wants to hear himself talk. And what separates a person that's just going out there and wants to talk about anything to a person that can actually build an audience? And I think it comes down to content. And it's 100% important to get in there, get people involved. And whether it's people that like what I'm saying or don't like what I'm saying, I encourage it. I say comment away. Go to town. Call the phone number. Rail on me as much as you want. The bottom line is, the following is going to continue from, what it is that I'm doing. And you could disagree with every single thing that I say. You could just be some random person that's just on to talk about whatever you want. You could be on a comment thread just saying 100 different things. But, it's getting into, the stuff that this show covers. And that's baseball, sports, and unifying America. And next week we're going to have a couple different guests in. David Bahnson wrote a book called Crisis of Responsibility. And he's going to come on the show. He's going to talk about, everything that went down to doing the book and everything that is reaching America. And the bottom line is we're in a country that decides to just be so divided. And we're so out there just wanting to go out of our way to just, else has another. And we don't listen to the fact that there's somebody out there that feels differently or is differently. And it's got to change at some point. We have to be more open-minded to other people that feel differently and act differently and look differently. Until that happens, we're not going to go anywhere. Another guest we're going to have on next week is Jerry Eisenberg in Las Vegas, Nevada. He's a man that's been in radio and media for the past 50 years. Goes back to the days of Howard Cosell. We're going to talk a little bit about Cosell, one of the guys that I look up to in the world of sports and broadcasting. So we're gonna have a couple different guests than we're used to in regards to having players and stuff like that, which will just come up at any time. But now the first thing I wanted to touch on today is, we talked yesterday about what was going on in regards to the agent that ends up going to jail for his website and screwing up the Melky Cabrera situation, or basically trying to get him to a point where they could go to this website and say that drug test that he took and failed was something that should not, was a wrong test, or they have some kind of record of all the drug tests that are taken on one website. And this guy comes out of jail, and the bottom line is he's coming out and he wants to make a name for himself. He wants to speak up of himself, maybe clear his name, maybe look a little better, but also is coming out of there with a little bit of vengeance. And if there's anybody that has served time in prison, which I have not, may be able to attest to that. Maybe the guy that's on Periscope ragging on me, 100% different, all these different things, saying whatever it is that he wants. Maybe you could talk about what it's like to be in prison. People that come out with tenacity and vengeance. And they want to, number one, make a name for themselves, and number two, they want to go after everybody that they feel has wronged them. And this guy is coming out after having to serve a little bit of time, and of course he's going to go right to the media. Of course he's going to jump right into wanting to talk about what happened with the Melky Cabrera thing. He's going to want to talk about his relationship with ACES, which is the agency that he was representing. And go on and on about, maybe naming some players that he feels knows were using PEDs, if he wants to go that route. I mean, if he's a guy that's representing players, it wouldn't be in his best interest to do that, but maybe he's turned a page. Maybe he wants to go in a different direction now. Maybe he wants to, focus on what it is that he, has done before and kind of turn coat on it. Maybe go the other way and go after players that he knew were using PEDs and wants to get their names out there. But, his credibility is pretty much shot. So we're talking about a guy that's getting, attention from, what it is that, he did before. But, this, to me, I just don't think there's any more to talk about, a guy that just simply wants to go out there and make a name for himself. But a couple different things I want to mention in regards to baseball. And, Chase Utley ends up signing with the Los Angeles Dodgers, another 2-year deal. And he's going to probably retire as a Dodger. Maybe he's decided that after the 2019 season, it's going to be it. He's going to hang it up. But there was a comment thrown out there about the possibility of him being a Hall of Famer. And, in reality, I look at his numbers and I say that, from a postseason standpoint, he put up some great numbers. Kind of in some ways, a little bit Ortiz-like, a little bit of Manny-like, a little bit when, the regular seasons were kind of good, some all-star seasons, a good defensive second baseman, a very good leader, but seemed to rise to the occasion when it comes to the postseason. I look at a player like this and I say there's no way that you can make a case that he's a Hall of Famer. Now, I say that, but when we hear all the discussions of the breaking down of the analytics and the different numbers and stuff like that, there's going to be a case, whether it's Brian Kenny or, some of the guys over, that are stat crunchers are going to try to make a case that he's a Hall of Famer. Here's the problem that we have, and I've said this 100 times. Baseball has watered down its Hall of Fame to a point that we're now looking at the career of a Chase Utley. And in some cases, whether it's a Scott Rowland or some other players that we would say, if we look back in a generation of players that just played, we'd look at them as not Hall of Famers. We'd say they're really good players. They had good careers. In some cases, they deserve to have their numbers retired by the respective teams that they played for. But they're just simply not Hall of Famers. Now we've taken a generation which we've clouded with the thought of who used steroids and who didn't use steroids. And the Barry Bondses and the Roger Clemens and the Manny Ramirez's, the guys that put up ridiculous numbers, that if they played in any other generation or didn't have the cloud of the use of performance-enhancing drugs involved with them, they would be looked at completely different. They would be in a Hall of Fame. And we wouldn't be having these discussions about these tertiary players. And there's a lot of players that are on the outside looking in. And they don't really belong when it comes to the Hall of Fame discussion. But we bring them up now because of the fact that we've blackballed in our own minds, whether it's the fans, the media, whether it's the people that are involved in the game, we've decided that we're going to decide that there's a whole bunch of players that played that's numbers and contributions to the game didn't count. Barry Bonds hit 762 home runs. And we're going to just make believe that between the years of 1986 and 2006, he didn't exist. He didn't hit more home runs than anybody that ever played the game before him and after him. So because of that, that leaves room in the Hall of Fame for players that were above average, good, in some cases all-stars, but were not Hall of Fame caliber players. So what's going to continue to happen, and we're going to see it over the next couple of years, because the next year's Hall of Fame, first-timers with Mariano Rivera and Roy Halladay, and really outside of that, it's going to be a mixture of what we've seen on the ballot over the past couple seasons. So this year, obviously, when you had the guys that end up going into the Hall of Fame, Edgar Martinez is going to be pretty close. I think he's probably going to get in. But even Edgar Martinez, and listen, I respect his numbers, the 9-something OPS that he had over the course of his career. He was one of the best pure hitters in the American League during the time that he played. But if these other players are getting in, the ones that are tied to steroids, the Bondses, the Clemenses, Manny Ramirez, Sammy Sosa, Mark McGwire, Rafael Palmeiro, when you look down at their numbers, you say they put up Hall of Fame numbers over the course of their career. Baseball, and a lot of it's the fans, a lot of it's the media, a lot of it is people that are associated with the game that decide to put baseball on this pedestal and make it so much different from other sports. And when the discussion about each individual player is about, what is it that we could pull out about them to take them out of discussion or take them out of the Hall of Fame, it's different than it's run in football or basketball or hockey. And every single one of these other sports have the best of the best. The ones that made the biggest contributions numbers-wise are in. But not baseball. Baseball seems to look for every single reason to dig as much into the dirt of each individual player and figure out what they can do to disqualify them, or say in the same words that the players disqualified themselves. But what this is doing, and I'm going to continue to rant about this because I think, baseball at some point has to look at its numbers, look at its history, and say the best players of each individual generations are put in up until Pete Rose. And you could say Pete Rose did it to himself, but still nobody before or after him had any more hits during their entire playing career. And it's unfortunate. And obviously Pete Rose had a lot to do with that. And he is the reason why he is looked at and vilified and probably will not have the opportunity to be reinstated into baseball till, unfortunately, after he passes away. But, looking at the players that use steroids, and there's a ton of them that did. And you know what? There's a handful of them that are in the Hall of Fame now. Now, it's not fair for anybody to say, hey, I think this player used or that player used, because that's the unfortunate thing that has kept players out of the Hall of Fame for years upon years. Speculation. When, you're looking at it, there really is no actual proof to say whether somebody is, did use performance-enhancing drugs or did not use performance-enhancing drugs. So we're going to continue to go this route by saying we suspect that Barry Bonds used. He admitted that he used something but didn't take it willingly. It was in his cream or whatever. However he wants to word his story, there's still not 100% proof that Barry Bonds used performance-enhancing drugs. And we're going to continue to say, all right, look at the head test. Look at how big his head got. Look at how big his muscle mass got. And that's fine. You can discuss that all day. But when we're looking at the players as a group, instead of individually, we're talking about, the lack of facts that exist to say that each one of these players definitely used throughout their entire playing career. And the one that I like the most when we talk about Bonds, was Bonds a Hall of Fame player before he started using or after he started using? Like, we know the exact date that he took his first steroid. Like, we know that it was, 2001, March or, February or December of 2000 that he decided to start cycling, PEDs. Before that, he didn't. And we use the same silly rhetoric that's out there that says that we cannot, there's no way that we're going to know for sure whether a player used or didn't use. But the time that goes by, we say, all right, I feel like Barry Bonds started using.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is the Pass Ball Show brought to you.
And we're going to have to take a quick break here. Sorry about that. Happy to be back with you. This is the Pass Ball Show brought to you by JohnPielli.com. The number, if you want to be involved, 732-364-3598. That's 732-364-3598. And I'll tell you, this is, thinking about the use of performance-enhancing drugs in baseball is something that, we're going to continue to judge players based off of what we think that they did. And, when it comes to the law, the law is set up to where you could commit a crime or be accused of a crime, and then having the right to hire a lawyer, have a trial by jury and judge, and then have a verdict put out of whether you did it or not. And even if you're convicted or if you're found guilty in a court of law, you still have the opportunity to appeal. And if the appeal process goes through and you find that you are not guilty there, then you are, set up to a point where you could go on with your life as a free man. But when it comes to baseball and the use of performance-enhancing drugs, the judge, jury, and executioner is the general public and the baseball writers and the media and the fans. And you're not treated as if it's, it's as fair as you would have if you were convicted of a felony or a murder. And, we still get into this discussion where we say we want to hold players out. We want to use the Baseball Hall of Fame as if it's this great thing that's set up for us, that only the best of the best, but not only the best of the best, but the nicest people, the kindest people, the people that best exemplify what's best about baseball belong. Yet, Cap Bahnson is in the Hall of Fame. Ty Cobb is in the Hall of Fame. And we could have debate back and forth over whether Cobb was really as bad as he was perceived to be. But Cap Bahnson was a racist bigot. He single-handedly did everything he could to keep a black player out of baseball when there was plenty of opportunity for an African-American player to play at that time. He did what he could. He held his ground. The fact that he had an influence in the game kept the game segregated, well past his death. But, you look at the Hall of Fame plaque and there's nothing negative that says about Cap Bahnson, only that he had 3,000 hits and he managed the Chicago team forever. Played 20-something seasons in the big leagues. Was one of the better pure hitters of his generation. Yet we're going to take steroids and we're going to hold them against Barry Bonds as if he's the freaking devil. The guy hit more home runs than anybody in baseball history. And, you look down on him as if he is not deserved of being amongst the best of the best to ever play. When it comes to offensive position players, in regards to what he did with power, on-base percentage, and obviously the home runs, I could only see a handful, maybe 3. If there's any more than 3, it may be 4. Offensive players that were more impactful in the history of Major League Baseball than Barry Bonds. Yet, we look at it as if he's just some bad person that doesn't belong to be anointed as one of the best of the best. And what is happening because of it, Barry Bonds can't be in a Hall of Fame. So in the writers' terms, in the fans' terms, in the people that are outside the game, not involving themselves in baseball, but they're judging from afar, they're deciding that somebody has to take his place. And this isn't a knock on Chase Utley. Chase Utley was a very good player. He will probably finish his career with over 2,000 hits. His numbers in the postseason were very good, especially for those Philly teams. The 2008 team that won the World Series, the team that went back there in 2009. He certainly has a flair for the dramatic. He came up with a bunch of big hits and a bunch of big moments throughout his playing career. But Chase Utley isn't a Hall of Famer. But he may get more consideration than he would have anyway because of Barry Bonds. Because Barry Bonds is a guy that absolutely, under no circumstances, should never not be in a Hall of Fame based off of his numbers. But he's being blackballed from the Hall of Fame. And because of that, there's going to be somebody that is less deserved that's going to be in the Hall of Fame because of it. And we could talk about some guys that were voted in. Alan Trammell is a guy that I was very much in favor of getting in. And, Jack Morris was a borderline guy. I thought, was dominant, probably the best pitcher of the 80s, threw the most innings, was the biggest workhorse, was certainly a throwback to a generation where pitchers, wore the game on their sleeve, went out there and were going to pitch regardless. the game's 5-5 in the fifth inning, you knew Jack Morris was going to stick it out and probably pitch 9 that day. As we hit the halfway point here on the Pass Ball Show. Once again, John Pielli with you. The number, if you want to be involved in the program, 732-364-3598. That's 732-364-3598. Now, you look at some players that are in now, and Morris could be one of them. Craig Biggio could be another. You look at some of the very good careers, whether it's a Jim Thome or a Chipper Jones. Those guys probably get in regardless, whether the steroid era existed or not. But, we're going to continue to see players get in and get a little more consideration than they would have gotten before because of the steroids era of players. And at some point, you hope that there's going to be a little bit of a change. Now, there's people that are, whether, they're in the media, whether they're baseball writers, whether they're just fans of the game, that are going to say under no circumstance should there ever be a player that has any implication with steroids in the Hall of Fame. That ship has sailed already. Because without naming names, I promise you there is a player, or 2 or 3, or maybe 5 or 10, that used performance-enhancing drugs and steroids over the course of their career. Whether they spent their entire career on it remains to be seen. But when we talk about something that was found in Mark McGwire's locker, or the side of Mark McGwire's locker, the andro, and you find later on that there is enough of an indication that there is, it's close enough to an anabolic steroid. And a player like Mike Piazza, who I would say was one of my favorite players that I've ever seen play, admits to using andro. Isn't he in fact admitting that he used something that's close enough to a steroid? But how many other players used andro over the course of their career? How many Hall of Famers? So it really depends on the way you want to look at it. So if you're trying to keep the game clean and saying that, the more that we continue to leave players out that we suspect may have used performance-enhancing drugs, well, the levee is kind of broke a little bit. The water's kind of trickling in. And at some point, the floodgates should open. The levee should break. And we should acknowledge the best players of each generation. We haven't gotten to the point where we've passed the quote-unquote steroid era. And because of that, it's still a little bit of murky water. Maybe 20 years from now, we'll look back at it at just another time. Baseball in its history has so many different eras. And we try to say, we put them in maybe 20-year increments, but some of them were a little shorter. Some of them were a little bit longer. You got the initial days of baseball with Harry and George Wright. And the best players of that time frame. Remember, baseball seasons were 40 games or 50 games, in the 1870s and the 1860s. And then you go to the dead ball era, or the pre-20th century baseball. We had players that were based on speed, hitting the ball on the ground. And then as you get closer to the 1920s, you had players that, mastered the dead ball era, whether it was a Ty Cobb or Sam Crawford. Guys that played an era. I mentioned Cap Anson before, but he was more of a 19th century guy. But the game changed when Babe Ruth started hitting home runs in the 1920s. And then players were judged based off of how many home runs they hit. And then we went into the late 1940s when the game started to be segregated. But prior to that, you had the war years where players dominated because so many other players were out of the sport and weren't playing. So they started getting acknowledged for playing the game a little bit differently. But we look back at players that played, prior to 1920 and say, hey, there wasn't a lot of home runs hit. But there were still players that dominated that era. And we go into the days of, the late 1940s and the 50s where you have all the best of the best because the game is integrated. All the top black players are no longer playing in the Negro leagues. They're playing alongside the top white players. So it made for probably the greatest time or the glory years of baseball in the 1950s, 60s, and the early part of the 70s. And it probably was a little bit tougher for some players to get jobs in the 1950s and 60s. There were some top players that may not have gotten a chance to play in the major leagues because of the amount of competition that was out there. And then we continue to move on. The steroids era, what I'm getting at, is going to be remembered as just another time in baseball history. And we may want to look down upon it and look down upon the players that conceded to steroids or felt like they needed to use them to advance their career or give themselves an opportunity to compete with the other players that were already using. But the more time goes by and the more baseball continues to clean its act up, the more removed we're going to be from this as a generation and a time. So my answer may be, hey, put the best players of each generation in the Hall of Fame right now. It's not going to happen at that pace. I understand that. But I promise you this. If traction doesn't pick up in the next couple of years, which it may, you're looking at where Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, exist in regards to the amount of votes that they're receiving. It's growing up a little bit. They're getting a little bit closer. More older age writers are either dying off or retiring. And more younger writers that witnessed firsthand what these players did and accomplished are going to start to get more votes. So I think there's a chance before the 10-year period is over that they may get close enough. But I think as time goes by, and I think when it comes down to the Veterans Committee, and the Veterans Committee is also going to go through a little bit of a revolution. It's not going to be the same people that are making up the Veterans Committee. There's going to be new Hall of Famers that are on that committee. There's going to be new executives that are going to be on that committee. You're going to look at, the new age of general managers and team presidents that are going to have more of a sabermetric mindset, that are going to think a lot differently than other people that were on these veterans committees. So we might actually hit a time where players may have a better chance of getting inducted in a Hall of Fame through the Veterans Committee than they ever had before. Because you look at the way the Veterans Committee is gone, yeah, there are some candidates that come out there and get a shot right off the bat. You look at last year with Bud Selig and John Sherholtz. This year when Alan Trammell and Jack Morris. And I think Alan Trammell and Jack Morris getting in this way may open the door for a lot of other players that played during that time to get the opportunity to do the same thing. But what about the time where the Veterans Committee is naming players like Bonds and Clemens on the ballot? It's going to come down to, it's going to go from 500 to 600 writers and having to get 75% of their votes to a cast of 16, either Hall of Famers, writers, executives, people that are associated with the game. I think it's a lot easier to get 75% of 16 than it is 75% of 500 something. So for all of those that are holding out, whether you're a fan of the game, whether you're involved in the game, whether you're a baseball writer that has the opportunity to vote for the Hall of Fame every year, the time is going to come where the best of each generation are going to get their say and are going to get their time and are going to get their call into the Hall of Fame. You may not like that. You may not want to hear that. That may be something that may bother you to a point where you're going to lose it. How could they, in some people's minds, put players in a Hall of Fame that use performance-enhancing drugs? The answer, and it may not be answered now, but it will over time, I promise you, will be because they were still the best of the generation that they represented. And if you go back to the best of the 19th century ball players, the best of the dead ball era ball players, the best of the, home run generation players that started with Babe Ruth, to integration, to the glory years, to the 80s, going into the 90s. You've seen the pattern that has been set from the inception of baseball history. And it is stated that the best of every generation makes up its Hall of Fame. And its Hall of Fame is the best that have ever done it. So you can't have a Hall of Fame, whether you want to make a case that steroid players should not be in. I'd hate to say it. There's going to come a time, or become a time, where they are in. And it might not be for another 15 or 20 years. Well, I think we'll find out this year how much traction Bonds and Clemens get on a ballot that isn't as stacked as it has been over the last couple of years. You're looking at Mariano Rivera and probably Edgar Martinez, maybe Roy Halladay. Outside of that, there really aren't that many sure things. And even Halladay, who I believe is a Hall of Famer, and I think most people that are involved in baseball and understand the game look at him as a Hall of Famer. The comparisons to Pedro Martinez, he certainly dominated a 10-year stretch, very similarly to the way Pedro did, though I think Pedro was better. Pedro was more dominant. Halladay was very good. But it may take a couple of years to get him in, even though he unfortunately has passed away. I know there will be some sympathetic gestures put towards Roy Halladay. He'll get votes. He may very well get in on his first year of eligibility. And his chances are increased because you're only looking at really Mariano and possibly Edgar Martinez. Now, the interesting thing that I think when in regards to Edgar Martinez, I know he saw the amount of votes that he got increase dramatically from last year. It was up almost 20%. Has he hit a point where there are as many people that are against him going in a Hall of Fame that may not be willing to change their votes? Has he plateaued? Is he going to be stuck at around a 70, 71% the next, year or two that he's available or eligible? But once again, when it comes to the Veterans Committee, and I think the Veterans Committee is going to really reshape the game over the next 15 to 20 years, or next 10 to 20 years, in a way that it's never done it before. Because you're going to find a lot of players are going to be either run off the ballot by now getting 5%, or run off the ballot because their 10 years have lapsed. And it's not 15 anymore. But you're going to see a series of Hall of Fame votes that may start inducting more players off of the Veterans Committee than off of the actual ballot. And to come for full circle, and what I'm saying is we may finally get to a time where it's not going to be just the baseball writers that are going to have the say in who gets in the Hall of Fame and who doesn't. Now, this is something that's gone back from years, from the inception. The first vote that took place in 1936. You're looking at something that's, 80-something years old that has been done the same way. And baseball is a game that, in those 80-something years, has changed in a number of different ways. So, why would its voting process not be subject to any sort of change? But I think the writers will continue to cast their votes. The 500-something writers will be able to nominate and put in whoever it is that they want to vote for. Whoever gets 75% will continue to go in. But I tell you, we're starting to build a little bit of a pool on the side of Hall of Fame caliber players in Major League Baseball that are on the outside looking in, that probably deserve based off of their numbers and their accomplishments, to be up there with the best of the best. Barry Bonds is one of the top 5 offensive position players to ever play the game. And whether you're mad at him because he did steroids or not, whether you want to take anything away from the fact that he used steroids, the numbers that he put up were absolutely immortal baseball numbers. And if you have a Hall of Fame in baseball and you can't include him in there, it's speaking of a lot of other issues. And like I said, for every Barry Bonds that you don't put in a Hall of Fame, consideration is going to be given to a Chase Utley or Scott Rowland or a Johan Santana, who once again I think are all good players, had very good careers. But none of them are Hall of Famers. But the more Barry Bondses that baseball keeps out of its Hall of Fame, the more watered down it's going to be. The more Craig Biggio's are going to get in. The more Andre Dawson's and Tony Perez's and Bill Mazeroski's and Rabbit Marinville's and Ray Schalk's and Freddie Lindstrom's. Players that if you look at their careers, you could say were very good. But when you're talking about a bunch of other players that put up similar numbers and are not being considered for the Hall of Fame, that's when you start questioning what the Baseball Hall of Fame is all about. And that's why it's not the same as any of the other sports Hall of Fames. How many professional football players dominated the sport and are not in a Hall of Fame? You know, we came close to perhaps having that discussion when it came to the likes of Randy Moss and Terrell Owens. You know, receivers that were kind of those quote-unquote divas were looked at differently because of the way they played the game, but the numbers were still there. But you know what? The Pro Football Hall of Fame came to its senses and put them in. At some point, baseball is going to do it as well. And if it drives you crazy, so be it. The baseball writers might not do it, but at some point the Veterans Committee is going to do it. Because when the accomplishments of the players that are on the outside are starting to get better than the accomplishments of the players that are on the inside, and I will tell you this, Barry Bonds might not be my lifetime, might not be your lifetime, but at some point, the steroids era is going to be looked at as just another time in baseball history. Be back with you tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in. This is the Pass Ball Show, brought to you by JohnPielli.com, as well as St. Aloysius Church. God bless you, and as always, I'll see you on the other side.